Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Laura Namy. I'm the Executive Director of the Society for Research in Child Development. Today is the second in a series of conversations that we're hosting called At Home with the Child Experts. Today's focus is on the science of screen time during COVID-19. We have received hundreds of questions in advance. Thank you all so much for submitting them. And a lot of them have touched on similar topics. So clearly, a lot of you share some of the same concerns, and we'll try to address those as comprehensively as possible today. So know that we've sort of tried to distill things down into some general questions that reflect many people's concerns, even if we're not reading your question verbatim. As the conversation progresses, if you have other questions, please do feel free to type them into the Q&A box, which is located to the right of your video image. We are monitoring that feed, and we'll touch on new issues that come up as time permits. So we're so pleased to welcome two experts on child development who are with us today, Dr. Rachel Barr, who is a professor of psychology at Georgetown University, and Dr. Yalda Uhls, who is a faculty member in the psychology department at University of California, Los Angeles, and is the author of a recent book on parenting in the digital age. Thank you both for being here. So let's just kick things off first by asking you to share. I know a lot of parents are feeling very guilty or very conflicted right now about the inevitable increase in screen time use that's happening in most homes across the country. What does the research tell us about both the positive and the negative effects of screen time? And I think, it's important for us to engage this question in a way that recognizes different answers for different ages of children. So Rachel, maybe we could have you start out by talking briefly about what the research is on younger children, and then Yalda, maybe you could shift to talking about some of the research with older children and teenagers.
Perfect. Great. So we know that there are both positive and negatives. And I want to start with the positives, actually. So we know that if babies and young children are exposed to educational content that is well developed and that they're supported by people around them, playing with digital media, engaging, talking about media, then this is associated with good outcomes. We also know that content is really critical, and so for young kids, the content that is negative might be surprising to you. In fact, it's mostly background media, so things like the news playing in the background or a gardening show playing in the background that has negative effects. And why does that happen? It's because when the baby is playing or the young child is playing, every time there's a little beep or a buzz, the child looks up to the screen. It makes absolutely no sense at all. But then they have to go back to their real work of play and start over. So they're building a tower, they get to 2, then that beep comes on, they look away, then they come back. Where was I? I need to go to build a tower of 3. At that point, the tower is really hard to build, so they ask their parent, can I have some help? But the parent is engrossed in listening to the media, so they're at a double whammy. So it's actually adult type media in the background that has these negative consequences for their early development. And one other positive, so video chat can be very good for maintaining communication, particularly now.
Yeah, and I would also actually add for younger children that parental media use when the child is trying to get your attention sometimes can be distracting as well. It's important to put the device down and engage with your child face to face, and during COVID times, I know that's challenging, but every once in a while. But for older children, the good news is really there is a lot of positive research. There are certainly costs, and every child and every family is different. So, you know your child and you know your family best. But there's a lot of research that finds, for the most part, kids are using, tweens and teens are using social media and these devices to connect, to self-disclose, to develop identity. They have a strong need to belong. They're using it for all sorts of ways to actually communicate with their friends. And in COVID times where they're actually physically separated with their friends, it's more important than ever that they are able to connect with these devices. And also video games, there's lots and lots of positive research. It teaches spatial learning. There are many children that actually learn things, Minecraft, and there are a lot of different games where they're learning sort of this eye-hand coordination that you might be surprised research finds is very, very helpful. Of course, there are costs, and if your child isn't sleeping, if they're not eating, if they're staying only on the device and not interacting with you or their friends, then I would be careful and maybe try to suggest they take a little bit of time off. Balance is the key. You want them to go outside every once in a while if you have the benefit of, just a little area where they can go out, or you want to put the devices down in certain times of the day, and the whole family has to do that together. So you're modeling that kind of behavior. So ultimately, and I think we'll get to this, the good news is the research doesn't say there's this magical amount of time that is perfect for every family and every child. It's really more about content, context, communication, and the individual child, to quote Lisa Guernsey's framework.
So that's all really helpful, and there's a lot to unpack in here, right? So you've brought up a lot of different things in terms of types of engagement, content, parent modeling, all those sorts of things. So let's try to walk through some of those, because all of those are things that parents have been posing questions about. But I think it bears sort of revisiting and repeating, because I think the single biggest question that we've been getting is this question of how much is too much, and how do I make sense of making exceptions during this lockdown period to what were some very thoughtful or thought out and expert guided rules about usage. So Yalda, do you want to kind of revisit that a little bit in terms of that issue of how much is too much? And then Rachel, maybe from an early development childhood perspective, amplify that as well.
Yeah, so a lot of people are aware of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations, and most of those are actually more pertinent to younger children. So Rachel can certainly get into those. I think for older children, it's really about knowing your child. It's about balance and moderation. It's about high quality content, really thinking about the content, and then engaging with them around the content, and even engaging with them in a positive way. Be interested in their media world, talk to them about what they're doing, and even if they're interacting with something you don't necessarily approve of or think is the best way for them to do it, don't necessarily take it away from them or be negative about them. Talk to them and engage them in a conversation about your values and why you don't think it's appropriate. Your tween teen is more sensitive to your opinions than you think. It's just when we are judging them and putting them in a defensive position, they will react. But if you engage them in conversation, you might be surprised. And ultimately, I just say, in terms of time, don't worry about it. Lots and lots and lots of research says there are positive effects. The negative effect research has gotten bigger sort of media play, but we know we can communicate with this stuff, and that's more important than ever.
So Rachel, from your perspective, in terms of those guidelines, and also, are there some opportunities to still have some guardrails in place, still have some policies or some structure in place for how we give kids access to the technology opportunity?
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate just what Yalda was saying, like all screen time is not equal, especially for very young children. So thinking through about that content and thinking through when you're going to share media with them, when they may have a little time on their own. And this really comes to the idea of a media plan. So Common Sense Media has got a really nice tool that's called the Family Media Agreement. And essentially what it is it just walks through and helps you consider for your family, what is it that the child might need throughout the day? So not just media, but what do they need in terms of outside play? What do they need in terms of having conversations over meal times? What do they need in terms of sleep? How do they need to connect? And at the moment during COVID, that may mean more video chat than before, catching up with their friends and family. Even for very young children, we know that video chat can be very effective means of communication and a very good support for parents too. So it's not the absolute amount, but you do want to have a plan in place. And the nice thing is that then as we hopefully move out of these COVID conditions, you can keep on revisiting the plan and thinking what's working for your family as conditions change, and discussing that with your child as well. So, yep, it's time for us to see a show right now, but it's going to be bedtime, so we're turning the show off now, and we're going to start to get ready for bed. So just for really young kids, saying this is when this is going to happen, this is when it isn't going to happen, and having those mindful practices sort of in the back of your mind around media as well. So not amount, but plan.
Yeah,
perfect.
And that plan just, it works all the way up to tween years, and I can't emphasize not only, that is what most media experts suggest, and I've practiced it in my own home, and it works.
Great. So, Yalda, you had talked about sort of had used the term content to think about sort of what's a good way to think about effective use. What constitutes good content, from TV, from educational applications, entertainment and video games? What's the difference between adult-oriented content and child-oriented content? And then, are things like having background music the same as having background TV? Is that something that we need to feel like, right? So what are some guidance that you might offer in terms of that content?
Yeah. So I think content, many of us, I think on some level are familiar with what is good content and bad content. You probably have a gut check yourself. There's certainly places you can go to. Common Sense Media is one that's been suggested. The Motion Picture Academy has, PG-13 and R-rated. And what's nice about Common Sense, though, and even the Motion Picture rating, is they give you a really big breakdown of what's in the content. So you'll know about violence, you'll know about role models, you'll know about sex. And each family, again, is different. Some families have a higher tolerance for violence. European families might be have a lower tolerance for violence and have a higher tolerance for sexual content. So it's really important, if you're doing this media plan, or to really talk about what you think is good content with your child, and help them. So in the beginning, you're probably very used to being the gatekeeper. Yes, you can watch that. No, you can't watch that. But I recommend that you start to help your child think about this themselves, because when they leave, and even as they get to those tween and teen years, they're making their own choices. And the earlier you start to help them understand why you and your family feel that something's appropriate or not appropriate, they'll start making those decisions on their own as they get older. Was that all it was the content question. I think there was a second part, but good.
Can I can follow in on the background TV versus background music. Yeah. And so background music is actually not problematic for young children. It's the switching back and forth to the screen and then back to their world, that switching that is challenging for young kids. And so if the music or even the radio is on in the background, this is less distracting for a baby. So that's actually kind of a good thing for us to know, that it won't distract them if it's just an audio in the background. The other thing I just wanted to add as an additional tool is that the science of learning has thought about how do we learn and how can kids best learn. And on 0 to 3, there's a nice tool, and to think about this content. There's like 70,000 apps. So for TV and movies and content, it's quite good. There's good regulations, as Yalda pointed out. For apps, 70,000 apps for preschool kids are called educational, tagged as educational, without any regulation whatsoever. So we need a little bit of an extra tool there, and this eAIMS tool is really useful. We know that kids learn if they're engaged, if they're actively involved, if the content is meaningful, and if there's some social component. So, for example, you might know that your child, animals are really meaningful to them. So you might want to go to a zoo webcam. During that zoo webcam, there might be activities that are attached that ask them questions that you see they're actively involved, they're learning something about animals that they're interested in, and there's a social component, so you can talk to them about those animals afterwards. Other kids, not so much. They may want to go to a car museum, or they might want to go and watch something about Curious George. They might be interested in sort of exploring the world in that way, and then going out into their backyard afterwards and exploring their own world. So knowing your own child and thinking about those E-aims is another good way to sort of have a check on the content. One last thing about the content with apps. One thing that we know is really hard for kids is if there are a lot of different distractors. So some apps will have lots of pop-up ads, they'll have lots of things that you click on and they go to some unrelated thing that makes no sense, like virtual stickers, then you come back to a random other place and then they advertise again. This is really hard content for children to process. So that means that they can't be actively involved. So that's one other thing to look out for in those apps.
Great. And we will share these resources. We will post some resources on the event page and share them with everybody who's registered when we send out the video. And we will be recording and sending out the video next week. Rachel, can you reiterate that acronym again, what the acronym stands for? Because I think
so choose your content via the E-aims. So what are the aims that you're looking for, the electronic aims, the E-aims is the acronym.
Good. So yeah, we will share that as well. So let's shift now. A number of parents have asked questions about, are some devices better than others? Or are there different devices that we should be using to optimize with different kinds of goals? So, is TV better for just like passive engagement and entertainment, whereas a tablet, because it's more active, is better for learning? Rachel, do you want to start that conversation?
Yeah, so the first thing, we often hear this idea that TV is passive, or that these videos are just passive. But I think probably what we've all learned in the past month or so by doing a lot of this engagement via video is that it's actually quite tiring and cognitively demanding. And so it is an active process when children, even adults, are trying to follow a storyline. So video content is great for processing stories, characters, concepts. So that might be when you want to choose a nice storyline. For young kids in particular, you want to have a short segment, so like 5 to 10 minute episodes, and that's why they do things like that in Clifford the Big Red Dog or Arthur, etc. Then for games when you might want them to be sort of learning different things like letter games or shape games, that might be where you want to use a well-designed app. So if you go to pbs.org, for example, there's nice shows there. This is for young kids. There's nice shows there, and then the apps that accompany the content. So then it helps the kid make sense. They watch Daniel Tiger to hear the story and the songs, and then they go to the app to try out some of those other concepts. So you can use them in tandem, and it's really very helpful to the child if that character is the same in both, to help them map together that information. And then just one final thing there is the device is good for different purposes, but then we really want to know, can the kid take that info out into the real world? So as a parent, your job is to help them connect the dots and go out into the world afterwards with some activities that match. So you might, after the show is over, there might be a show about blocks, and then, or Cars. My son always loved the movie Cars, and so afterwards, after Cars has played, you hear about Sally, you see all these different characters, and then you can do a car race with your own Matchbox cars to sort of connect the dots between the show and the real world.
Great suggestion. Good. And I just want to remind everybody that if you do have questions that you would like to post, you can do so in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. We're trying to work in as many of them as possible. So one thing that is coming up in the Q&A right now is that I think a lot of people are kind of surprised to hear or interested to hear a little bit more about the positive effects. So could you give a few more just quick specific examples of some of the positive effects of media exposure and how that relates to what you've been talking about in terms of this content analysis or content orientation, that the answer is not it's all bad or it's all good, it really depends. But what are some nuggets of examples where there's really some clear positive effects? Yalda, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of, we're accustomed as adults and parents, and there's even a term for it called a moral panic, where we are accustomed to looking at media as negative. In my book and when I do these talks, I always talk about the media that parents around the turn of the 19th century thought was awful. And you can go back and find newspaper articles about this, and it was books. When books were introduced and dime, novels and Pulp Fiction, parents were really freaked out about them, but then we adapted and now we pray our children read books.
Right.
But the reality is, we are accustomed to thinking of it that way because it doesn't feel familiar to us. But luckily, in the last 15 years, we've been able to do a lot of research and study this. And we found that by and large, for example, social media, video chat, all these things allow teens to do what is developmentally normal, connect with their peers and their friends and their, and use it to learn and use it to do all of the things that they are doing right now, much more than ever in COVID world. But we knew that as long as there was a balance, they were getting enough sleep, they were socializing face to face, doing other things, doing decently in school, that media is not really going to impact them in a very, very negative way. I mean, there's always individual differences, and there are certain children that might get, too into video games, or they might get very, very anxious. Young girls sometimes on social media, especially during that tween age, they experience fear of missing out, and that can be, anxiety provoking. But by and large, most teens say they use this stuff to connect with other friends. There's a great quote, "I'm not addicted to technology, I'm addicted to my friends," that a teen said in a focus group. And that is what the research says. And we're seeing it play out right now in COVID. If we didn't have this, if we didn't have the ability to do what we are doing right now, your tween would actually be suffering much more because they want to be with friends. They need to be with friends. So feel good about the fact that they have the ability to communicate.
Right.
And just to follow on from that, for babies as well, they also miss their friends and preschoolers. So video chat is another thing that is really useful for young kids. You might have to provide a little bit more support. Like I'm just thinking now, this other video chat that I had with this little 2-year-old recently with my friend, and he also is very into the movie Cars. And so we had cars set up on either side of the video screen, and we actually raced across the video screen. So having sort of toys and props available can really support in video chat. The two other nuggets of positive that I wanted to focus on was fathers. We haven't really mentioned fathers, but fathers are very good at digital play, are quite often more involved with introducing and teaching technology. And so that's one really important thing to sort of focus in on, how fathers adopt technology easily or more frequently, and then are really willing to engage and play around technology. And the final thing is that we have, 50 years of Sesame Street was just last year, and there's been really good research across time on this, where just to go back to why do we care about content, what this research has shown is that this media diet that has educational media in it, when they've watched kids from 2 to 14 years, those children who started off with that educational diet, by the time they were in high school, they were doing better in math, they were doing better were more likely to read, had strong friendships and so on. So we know the trajectory of a positive media diet can have long-term good effects as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I want to switch gears because we did get a number of questions, and I don't know how broadly people have been reading about or thinking about this, but we did get a number of questions about the effects of the blue light that's coming off of screens, and whether there should be goggles or filters, or whether we should be concerned about children's eye development, right? Is there something that's going to be affecting their vision longer term? Are there going to be more catastrophic effects because suddenly we're all spending more time on screens? Rachel, do you want to address that question?
Yeah. So the blue light idea is because when we wake up in the morning, outside there's more blue light, and then throughout the day the blue light changes and the light becomes more yellow, and that prepares us for falling asleep. So this is why, so the blue light may be interfering with sleep. However, it's a relatively small amount of blue light. Why not keep a filter? These filters can just be automatic, and essentially what happens is that if you've got one of these filters, you'll notice that throughout the day, your screen just becomes a little bit more yellow. And so particularly for kids who are sensitive to falling asleep and take a while to fall asleep, this might be a good idea. However, one additional thing, thinking about that media plan, is that some kids do take a long time to fall asleep, and as all parents, you want to sort of promote falling asleep at night, especially now when, well, maybe this is just my parenting, but so one thing to think about is to put a gap, especially for young kids, between when the screen goes off and their bedtime. So if the screen is off for at least an hour before bedtime, that can actually promote them falling asleep, because that melatonin that makes you sleepy will rise. The second thing is the eyesight. The eyesight concern is not as much. So our eyes accommodate, we look close, we look far. It's a good idea to take breaks. But what one study really found was that it wasn't to do with the repeated closeness to the screen like what we're doing right now. It was actually a study in China had kids take their screens either outside or have them inside. They had the same amount of time. But the kids who were outside, they actually, their eyesight was better. They were less likely to be short-sighted, to have myopia. And what they detected in the end was that there is different light outside than inside that the developing eyeball really needs. So the takeaway from that is spend some time outside each day as well.
Great. We're running quickly out of time. I want to throw one more question in that a number of people raised, which was thinking about how, a lot of younger kids are having kind of meltdowns when they're being, sort of compelled to disconnect, or teenagers are getting, attitude and showing, some defiant behavior. Guidance or advice on how to manage those challenges as parents. Yalda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question everybody asks, and that kind of transition from one activity to another is always something that children have exhibited, not just transitioning from screens to whatever you'd like them to do. So it's a parenting challenge. And for older kids, you have to allow them a little bit of wiggle room so that they feel independent in their choice of making that transition. But having this media plan where you can talk about breaks and you can talk about when you expect them to be with the family or go outside, or the different types of activities you expect them to do in addition to their screen time might help, because you're letting them also have some agency in the conversation and the decision. And one tip I would say is, rather than have a negative consequence when you do a media plan, or when you say, oh, if you don't get off your computer, I'm taking it away, or your phone away, try a positive consequence. So that teaches them self-regulation and teaches them to make good decisions on their own. So when they do, an example would be when they get off on their own, when you ask them to, then you can give them extra time, let them make a decision on their own about media.
So we need to wrap up. I'm sorry, Rachel, I know that there's so much more to talk about, but
I'll share a resource from Clear Learner for the young.
Okay. I think that the things that have sort of been, I mean, there's been lots of wonderful tips in here. The sort of big bottom lines is that there's not a hard and fast rule right now about how much is too much. It's more about being kind of thoughtful about the choices that you're making, about what your kids are engaging in and when, and having this media plan to sort of help guide some principled decisions about what that reflect your own values as a parent is sort of the take-home message. And again, we will be sharing some resources that our experts have referred to, and we will be sharing the video with all of you, and certainly encourage you to share those with other folks that you think would be interesting. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to our experts for sharing their incredible insights with us. I hope everybody found this as useful and interesting as I did. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the second in a series of discussions on how parents can navigate these difficult times, so do keep an eye out for more opportunities, and we will send the link to the video and post it on our SRCD website early next week. We really also would appreciate your feedback on this conversation and how we can continue to make this a better experience for parents. So you will be invited to complete a short survey after you log off today. If you happen to have the time, we'd welcome your input. From all of us at the Society for Research in Child Development, thank you for joining us. We wish you and your family health and serenity during these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.